Balmoral was supposed to offer the royal family something increasingly rare: privacy. Instead, one dinner became the setting for a confrontation so raw that Princess Anne brought the entire evening to an abrupt halt. Queen Camilla had erupted across the table, Sophie was left fighting tears, and Charles appeared unable to restore order. But Anne's intervention was more than a sister stepping into an argument. It was a warning that something inside the family had finally broken. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had gathered a small circle that evening, hoping Balmoral would calm tensions after several strained encounters. Balmoral is the monarch's Scottish residence, traditionally used as a retreat away from public duties. Yet privacy offered no protection once Camilla turned toward Sophie and accused her of quietly weakening her influence with the king. Sophie did not answer. She looked toward Prince Edward, swallowed hard, and tried to remain composed while he understood what had happened. His wife had been humiliated before the people whose trust mattered most. Camilla pressed harder. She suggested that Sophie's growing usefulness during difficult royal engagements had become calculated, designed to make Charles depend on her judgment. The trusted confidant shook her head, insisting she had never wanted anyone else's place. Edward moved closer, but Anne pushed back her chair and stood. The room changed instantly. She looked directly at the queen consort and said, "That is enough." No one mistook the words for a request. Charles remained seated, trapped between his wife, his sister, and the woman struggling not to cry. Anne did not soften. Her controlled anger made the warning sharper. In this dramatized account, her certainty revealed something important. She had heard warnings before. Sophie had spoken privately about earlier cutting remarks, and Anne had already begun to suspect resentment beneath the surface. Camilla realized the intervention was not spontaneous. The Princess Royal had arrived prepared. Sophie finally rose, and Edward went with her. Neither tried to win the argument. That restraint made the silence heavier. Camilla stayed behind with Charles, but Anne did too, and the king knew the confrontation was becoming more serious than an interrupted meal. Once the door closed, his sister made clear that the family was no longer dealing with wounded pride alone. They were dealing with trust, loyalty, and the possibility that personal insecurity had begun affecting royal relationships. The tears may have stopped the dinner, but they did not cause the crisis. To understand why Sophie became the target, the people seated around that table must be understood first. Nobody at that table arrived emotionally neutral. Anne carried decades of loyalty to her brother, but little patience for palace theatrics. Sophie had earned a reputation for steadiness precisely by avoiding them. Camilla understood how quickly influence could shift inside a family built around rank, access, and proximity to the sovereign. And Charles faced the most dangerous position of all. Every silence from him could now be interpreted as choosing one woman over another. Sophie sat alone after leaving the dinner, still hearing the accusation in her mind. She was a working royal, meaning a member of the family who regularly carries out official duties on behalf of the monarchy, and reliability had become her strength. Yet tonight that same reliability had been turned against her. Prince Edward entered quietly and sat beside his wife. He said almost nothing at first. He could see she was fighting tears again, but what wounded her most was not Camilla's anger. It was Charles failing to stop the attack immediately. Edward finally asked whether she wanted to leave Balmoral that night. Sophie shook her head. Leaving would make the argument look even larger, and she had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of family fracture. She admitted that Camilla's remarks had not begun at dinner. There had been smaller comments, uncomfortable pauses, and questions about why the king increasingly valued her judgment. Edward had noticed them too, but his wife had repeatedly asked him not to intervene. She had believed silence would preserve peace. Now that silence felt painfully expensive. Camilla felt no victory either. She remained with Charles, angry but increasingly defensive, as Anne refused to soften her position. The Queen Consort believed Sophie's growing closeness to the king had created an unspoken comparison, one in which calm service and quiet popularity made her own mistakes appear larger. Charles rejected that interpretation, but she pushed back. To her, influence inside the family could shift without anyone formally announcing it, and Sophie's place beside Anne had begun to feel threatening. Anne then told her brother what he had not understood. During earlier private conversations, Sophie had confided that Camilla's remarks were becoming sharper. The Princess Royal explained that these conversations had happened directly between them, not through gossip or anonymous palace whispers. Charles went silent. His sister had heard enough to recognize a pattern, and Edward's decision not to interfere suddenly confirmed how long the tension had been building. Charles finally understood why the dinner had exploded so quickly. Sophie had been protecting the family from confrontation, while Camilla had been interpreting that restraint as strategy. Anne had watched both sides move closer to disaster, and now one earlier moment could no longer be dismissed. She reminded the King of Windsor, and when Anne forced Charles to remember what happened there, the Balmoral explosion began to look less like an accident and more like the final consequence of a grievance left untouched. The real beginning was not at Balmoral. It came weeks earlier, inside a smaller gathering at Windsor, during a conversation so ordinary that nobody immediately understood its significance. Sophie had been praised for taking on a difficult royal engagement at short notice. Charles responded warmly. Anne agreed. Camilla said almost nothing. Then came one quiet exchange after the others began leaving. A remark that Sophie could not forget, and Anne would later identify as the moment everything changed. Sophie had stepped into the engagement because another senior royal became unavailable, and she had done it without complaint. A royal engagement simply means an official public duty carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and this one had demanded hours of preparation, travel, and careful handling. Charles thanked her personally afterward. Anne added that her calm under pressure had helped the family avoid embarrassment. Sophie accepted the praise quietly, but Camilla heard something else in it. Another example of the king relying on someone whose influence seemed to be growing without ever being formally announced. Camilla waited until the gathering began to break apart. Near the doorway, she turned to Sophie and delivered the sentence that would later echo through Balmoral. Helpfulness can become ambition when people applaud it too loudly. Sophie froze. She answered carefully that she had never wanted anyone else's place and had never treated service as a competition. The Queen Consort did not openly accuse her of more, but the meaning was unmistakable. What Sophie had considered loyalty was now being interpreted as strategy. Anne heard enough to understand the danger. She did not confront Camilla there. Instead, the Princess Royal found Sophie privately later and asked whether comments like that had happened before. Sophie hesitated, then admitted they had. In a documented account created for this dramatized narrative, she described another conversation in which Camilla had questioned why Charles wanted her opinion on a charitable program. The implication had been clear. Access to the monarch was becoming too informal, too frequent, and perhaps too personal. Sophie wanted the matter contained. She told Anne she could tolerate discomfort if it prevented a larger family rupture. But the older royal disagreed. She later spoke privately with Charles and warned him that resentment was building around someone who had done nothing except perform her duties reliably. The king listened. He even promised he would address it personally. Then he delayed. That delay changed everything. By the time the family reached Balmoral, Camilla suspected Sophie had spoken to Anne, while Sophie understood that the Queen now knew their private tension was no longer entirely private. Every smile became cautious. Every silence carried weight. So when Camilla finally confronted Sophie across the Balmoral table, every restrained remark from Windsor returned at once. and Anne was no longer willing to watch in silence. The argument becomes dangerous, because nobody can pretend it is about one sentence anymore. Camilla presses Sophie. Sophie tries to withdraw. Edward moves closer to his wife. Charles attempts to interrupt, but Anne gets there first. Her chair moves back. Conversation stops. And for several seconds, the woman known for rarely wasting words becomes the only person at the Balmoral table willing to say exactly what everyone else has been avoiding. Camilla turns directly towards Sophie and demands to know why private family tensions were discussed with Anne. To her, that confidence feels less like seeking comfort and more like gathering support. Charles tries to calm the room, saying everyone is exhausted and the conversation should continue another day. But the attempt fails. A working family, meaning the relatives who regularly carry out public duties for the monarchy, depends heavily on trust behind closed doors. Once that trust feels compromised, postponing the argument only makes the silence more dangerous. Anne rises before Sophie can answer. She tells Camilla that the trusted confidant will not be spoken to that way again. The queen consort fires back that the princess royal is interfering in something she does not fully understand. Anne does not flinch. She knows exactly what she has heard, and she knows the remarks began long before Balmoral. Edward reaches for Sophie's hand as his wife finally breaks her silence. Through tears, she says she never asked to become anyone's rival and never tried to replace anyone in Charles's confidence. Charles feels the argument slipping beyond anything he can dismiss as a bad evening. He tells Camilla that Sophie had raised concerns before, but the words immediately make everything worse. Anne then confirms, through the private conversations already described between herself and Sophie, that she warned her brother about the growing pattern. Camilla turns sharply toward the king. The meaning lands at once. He knew Sophie felt targeted, and he never told his wife how serious the situation had become. Camilla's anger suddenly shifts. She demands to know whether Charles has also discussed problems inside their marriage with Anne. He denies sharing intimate details, but admits he sought his sister's advice about keeping harmony inside the family. That distinction means little to the queen in that moment. She hears only that a private strain had already reached another person, before she understood how far it had spread. Anne ends the dinner before another accusation can follow. She is no longer stopping an argument simply because Sophie is crying. She is forcing Charles to confront what avoidance has created. Either this remains an unresolved private resentment, or the king establishes boundaries before it damages the family further. For the first time that night, the greatest pressure is no longer on Sophie or Camilla. It moves directly onto the king. A monarch can command ceremonies, approve schedules, and redefine responsibilities. Family is harder. Behind the closed doors of Balmoral, Charles now faces a choice no protocol can make for him. Camilla is his wife. Anne is the sister who has stood beside him for decades. Sophie is a loyal member of the working family who has just been reduced to tears under his roof. Whatever Charles does next will be interpreted not merely as comfort, but as judgment. Anne does not ask her brother to punish anyone. She asks him to establish a boundary. Charles understands the difference because his authority here is personal, not constitutional. Constitutional authority refers to the formal powers and duties attached to the monarch's public role. But this crisis is about family access, private arrangements, working expectations, and who can be placed together without causing further harm. He can change schedules, he can separate duties. What he cannot do is pretend the emotional damage has disappeared. Charles enters the private sitting room where Camilla is waiting for him. She expects reassurance after the confrontation. Instead, the king sits opposite her and says quietly that Sophie should never have been challenged in front of the family. The queen hears the criticism as rejection. She asks whether he now trusts Anne and the trusted confidant more than his own wife. Charles refuses the comparison. Loyalty, he tells her, does not require him to defend cruelty simply because it comes from someone he loves. Camilla pushes back, but the hurt beneath her anger is growing. Charles then admits something he had kept to himself. He had already noticed tension between her and Sophie. Rather than confront it directly, he had quietly reduced the number of situations where the two women needed to work closely together. The king had convinced himself that distance would cool resentment. Instead, the silence allowed suspicion to grow. Camilla realizes he had been managing the problem without telling her, and that realization cuts deeper than the criticism itself. Charles does not retreat. He tells his wife that until trust is repaired, there will be no further private confrontation with Sophie. If concerns arise, they will be raised through him, or discussed openly, with clear boundaries. Camilla stares at him, wounded by the decision, but he makes clear this is not about choosing Anne over her, or Sophie over their marriage. It is about stopping personal resentment from becoming humiliation. The decision spreads through Balmoral quickly, not through gossip, but through changed arrangements and careful distance. When Anne hears what Charles has done, she says little. When Sophie learns of it from Edward, however, she does not feel protected. She feels exposed. Charles has finally drawn a line, but boundaries imposed after humiliation cannot erase what happened before them. By morning, Balmoral is silent in a different way. The shouting has ended, yet nobody feels restored. Sophie has barely slept. Edward expects anger from her, perhaps even a demand that they leave immediately. Instead, she makes a calmer decision, one that unsettles him more. She will not demand an apology. She will not retaliate. But she will no longer place herself in private situations where dignity depends on everyone else deciding to behave. Sophie folds a scarf into an overnight bag and tells Edward she wants to leave earlier than planned. Around them, the household has already adjusted. Breakfast arrangements have been altered. Conversations are smaller, and Charles has made it clear that nobody should force an immediate reconciliation. Balmoral is meant to function as a private royal retreat, a place where the family can step away from public duties. But that privacy now feels almost unbearable. Every changed plan confirms that the argument has altered more than one evening. Edward supports his wife, yet he worries about what leaving might suggest. He tells Sophie that withdrawing from private gatherings could make it appear as though she accepts some share of blame. She answers that staying merely to prove innocence would be another kind of surrender. The trusted confidant has spent years serving without demanding attention. Now she refuses to remain somewhere simply because leaving might create the wrong impression. Her pain is quieter than the night before, but it is more settled. Anne arrives before the departure plans are final. Sophie thanks her for stepping in, then admits something the Princess Royal had not expected. Being defended so openly was almost as painful as being attacked. It confirmed that everyone at the table had witnessed her humiliation. Anne listens without interrupting. Then, through their private conversation, she tells Sophie that Charles has imposed a clear boundary on Camilla and has accepted responsibility for not acting when earlier concerns were brought to him. The king, she explains, knows his delay helped create this moment. Sophie finally says what hurt most. It was not the suggestion that she had gained influence. It was Camilla turning years of kindness toward Charles into something calculated. The accusation had made loyalty sound like ambition, and affection sound like strategy. Anne understands immediately why the wound runs so deep. The queen consort had not merely questioned Sophie's role, she had questioned her character. Then the final complication arrives. Before Sophie can leave Balmoral, Camilla asks for one private conversation with her. No Charles. No Anne. No Edward. No aides. Nobody standing between them. Nobody interpreting their words afterward. Sophie hesitates, then agrees. After a night defined by people speaking for them, Sophie and Camilla are finally about to face each other alone. There is no long table now. No king between them, no Anne ready to intervene, and no Edward waiting beside Sophie. In a small private room before Sophie's departure, two women who have spent years mastering royal composure finally speak without an audience. Camilla begins defensively. Sophie refuses to argue. Then one sentence changes the tone completely, because the conflict is finally stripped of rank, duty, and influence, and reduced to something painfully human: fear. Camilla had asked for the meeting herself. She told Charles only that she needed to speak directly to Sophie before the argument hardened into permanent family mythology. Private mediation simply means resolving a conflict without officials, advisors, or relatives controlling the exchange, and Sophie agrees on one condition: what is said stays between them, unless both later decide otherwise. The trusted confidant does not want Anne carrying her words back to the king. She does not want Edward defending her afterward. For once, there will be no shield on either side. Camilla begins by explaining that she had watched Anne and Sophie become two of Charles's most dependable voices during difficult periods. She insists she never resented service itself, but gradually felt herself being displaced inside her own marriage. Sophie does not raise her voice. She tells the queen consort that affection and reliability are not positions someone can steal. If Charles trusts Anne because she is his sister, and Sophie because she has served consistently, that does not diminish anyone else unless fear turns those relationships into competition. Sophie then says what she could not say at dinner. Camilla's accusation hurt because her relationship with Charles had always felt familial, never strategic. She had supported him during demanding moments because that was what family did. To hear that kindness described as ambition made years of loyalty feel contaminated. The trusted confidant tells her plainly that she cannot remain emotionally close to someone who studies ordinary kindness for hidden motives. Camilla falls quiet. Then, in this fictional private conversation, she finally admits what nobody had heard directly from her before. The outburst was not based on evidence that Sophie had undermined her. It came from insecurity. She had watched ordinary exchanges, praise from Charles, and Sophie's closeness to Anne, then assigned threatening meaning to them. The queen apologizes, not for being misunderstood, but for allowing fear to become accusation. Sophie accepts the apology, but she does not offer instant forgiveness. Trust, she says, cannot be restored by one conversation simply because the words are sincere. It will have to be rebuilt through behavior, restraint, and time. Camilla accepts that boundary. When they leave separately, neither explains what was said. Yet the change between them is unmistakable. The private crisis has reached its turning point, but the monarchy does not live entirely in private, and soon a single public image gives the country its first glimpse of the aftermath. Royal families survive arguments by keeping them behind walls, but silence itself can create a story. By the time cars begin leaving Balmoral, speculation is already building around an abruptly changed family schedule. Then comes the image that dominates the fictional morning coverage. Sophie leaving beside Edward, composed but visibly strained, while Anne stands several steps behind, watching her departure. No shouting, no statement. Yet the emotional distance captured in that single moment speaks louder than any palace explanation. Charles moves quickly to prevent the private dispute from becoming a public war. He instructs aides to describe the altered plans only as a family matter, and makes clear that nobody is to brief against either Sophie or Camilla. A palace briefing means information given by royal staff to journalists, formally or informally, and the king knows how quickly one hostile account could divide the family into competing camps. That matters because the argument is already painful enough without turning private hurt into a contest over public sympathy. Sophie feels that pressure almost immediately. She sees the growing attention around her departure and understands why people may interpret her silence as dignity under attack. Yet that sympathy unsettles her. The trusted confidant does not want the public to imagine she has defeated Camilla, or that the queen consort has become a simple villain. Their private conversation has already moved the conflict toward repair, however fragile. Edward understands her discomfort and stays close, reminding her that she cannot control every interpretation once an emotional family moment becomes public. Camilla experiences the same coverage differently. She sees how quickly a few uncontrolled minutes at dinner can reshape years of public perception. The Queen had feared that Sophie's closeness to Charles and Anne might diminish her standing. Now the outburst itself threatens to do exactly that. She watches the fictional coverage and realizes that anger intended to defend her place has instead made people question how secure that place truly is. Then one broadcast crystallizes everything. A fictional national news program opens its evening segment with the Balmoral departure image and describes Anne halting the dinner as a rare display of family intervention at the heart of the royal household. Near the estate gates, a small crowd gathers as photographers wait for further departures. What began as a private argument has become a public symbol of royal unity under strain. Charles refuses another statement. He believes words will only feed the story now. Instead, he decides the answer must come through behavior. The next appearance involving Sophie and Camilla will show whether Balmoral produced real change or merely temporary silence. The country has seen the fracture. Now the family must decide whether its next public moment will expose the damage or prove that boundaries can become the beginning of repair. In the end, the defining act at Balmoral was not Camilla losing her temper or Sophie leaving the table in tears. It was Anne refusing to allow humiliation to become normal. Her intervention forced Charles to confront a problem he had hoped distance would solve, forced Camilla to recognize what insecurity had turned into, and gave Sophie the courage to establish boundaries without abandoning the family. The dinner failed, but in failing, it exposed exactly what needed repairing. Charles finally accepts that silence had not protected anyone. It had only allowed resentment to deepen behind rearranged schedules and careful politeness. The king resolves that serious family disputes will now be addressed directly before they spread into public duties or private relationships. Anne understands why that matters. As the Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, she had never stepped in to defeat Camilla or elevate Sophie. She intervened because rank could never justify humiliation, especially inside a family already carrying the pressure of public expectation. Sophie later arrives beside Edward at a fictional family engagement with a calmness that feels earned rather than performed. Before the event begins, Camilla approaches her privately. There is no dramatic embrace and no attempt to pretend Balmoral never happened. Instead, the Queen offers a restrained greeting, and Sophie returns it. Edward watches his wife carefully and sees something important. She is no longer trying to prove that she is unhurt. She simply refuses to let the hurt control her. Charles finds Anne afterward and thanks her for acting when he hesitated. She does not celebrate being proved right. She tells her brother that waiting for a family problem to disappear is still a decision, and sometimes it is the most dangerous one. The monarch understands the rebuke because Balmoral proved it. His attempt to protect everyone from confrontation had instead brought them to a far harsher confrontation. Camilla accepts the consequence as well. Her fear of being displaced had created the very isolation she feared. By questioning Sophie's motives, she damaged trust with Charles, Anne, and the trusted confidant at the same time. Rebuilding that trust would not come through rank or reassurance. It would come through behavior. Sophie does not emerge as a victor over Camilla. Her victory is quieter. She refuses retaliation, accepts an apology without pretending the wound vanished, and establishes boundaries without bitterness. Anne protects dignity without turning the conflict into a personal war. Charles chooses intervention over avoidance. And the Queen finally confronts the insecurity behind her anger. That becomes the verdict of Balmoral. Rank could control the seating arrangement, but it could never command trust. The family did not return to what it had been before that dinner, and that was precisely why healing became possible. Balmoral began that evening as a refuge from public pressure. By the time the family left, it had become the place where silence finally lost its power, and where dignity, however painfully, reclaimed the table. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.